o'clock, so if everybody wants to start, we can. I haven't heard from Zach a while.
Well, I will not be able to make it.
So we'll open up the work session. On November 13th, are we recording?
We are.
We are, okay. We'll start with non-arranged participation. We have someone in the audience, so welcome. Please state your name and address for the record. Good to see you.
My name is Jim Chesney, and I live at 150 Jeffries. And I've recently been reading all the reports to the city council. And I'm here to learn about brownfield developments because, of course, I live next door to 3045 Broad Street. And I must say that I'm delighted in the recent memo from the planning department about the non-feasibility of that project. And when we discuss brownfield developments, I'm hoping that we can look a little bit at not just housing, but also the potential to use brownfield developments for public infrastructure improvements, especially the idea that we could use a portion of that property to develop a park that would accentuate the trailhead that's going in with the new historic Bell Road Bridge. So I just wanted to lay that on the table as the reason I'm here and what I'm interested in. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dan, first car was 66 Mustang.
Next, if there's anybody else online that I can tell, is there anyone online that wants to speak tonight at the meeting? Or did he just erase that, right?
Yeah, it's just that Grace.
Okay. All right, then we'll move to the purpose of the workshop, which is the discussion of changes in the Brownfield Redevelopment Financing Act. Let's have it over to Michelle.
Okie dokie. So you've got a lot of information in your packet, and there'll still be more to come. I know you're happy to hear about that. In addition to the sections of the Brownfield Act that were amended, they're highlighted. That way, as always, I'd like you to read everything you get, but the highlighted stuff is the stuff that's the important portion that you're going to be working with. I've also provided excerpts from the master plan regarding the housing goals that you've set, the objectives, future land use strategies. Again, the relevant sections are highlighted to help keep this moving. There's two excerpts from the Housing is Economic Development Guidebook, which is what Michigan Economic Developers Association put together earlier this year. A number of professionals worked on that. You've actually seen it before, it's been in your packet, but I've provided two specific documents out of it, or sections out of it. Why use a TIF and the housing problem. Because not only does it do a good job of explaining in general sense in the state, it also provides that really important graphic to help people understand what's affordable, what is attainable, and what's considered market rate. And then to that end, in front of you, I put for your enjoyment and reading, the 2023 income limitations documentation or summary. This is something HUD puts out every year. We're what's called the Ann Arbor, Michigan Metropolitan Statistical Area. And the median income for the county is $124,000. The income limits are identified in the next column, and it's either very low, extremely low, or just low. Low associates with 80%. The extremely low is less than 50%. It's usually 30% and below. And the very low falls between the 30 and the 60. Again, going back to that graphic that's in the excerpt for you. You can see how that average median income is spread out depending on whether you're a one-person family, 2, 3, etc. Most of the numbers deal with a 4-person family, so you can see that the AMI for a very low is 62,000. for a family of four. Extremely low, 37.2, and the low, 94,650. So where does market rate fit in that? Anybody making 124,000 or more is generally able to afford market rate housing. That's just sort of a very generic way of explaining that. I've included for you the information from the HUD website and how they come up with all this methodology, and I'll leave that to people who are much better with advanced math than I am. But it gives you a step-by-step calculation, and I provided that for each of those different income levels. The other portion that's in your report tonight is the Housing Task Force report, again highlighted, but one of the things that's also in here, and although it's last in your packet, it's one of the things that I'm hoping will help with our discussion, is when it comes to the recommendations, and this is something that council has recently talked about, is what are those recommendations? What are those next steps? The check marks indicate the things that you have addressed as part of the recommendations from the Housing Task Force. But there's also some question marks that those are kind of, where are we in those? Do we continue on with them? And then there's one that's actually in process. But one of the other things that that the committee had recommended was to have a public forum. And that was actually their first recommendation. And that was a public forum to get input from the current residents of and the people working in the city, to really have a boots on the ground, if you will, sort of information, so that it helps you as you go through figuring out how to deal with housing in the city. Does anybody have any questions for me before I start moving into the amendments in the Brownfield Act and start getting into that discussion and questions?
There's nobody yet.
Okay,
Thank you, though. Okay, and just raise your hand, jump in, Michelle, call you, see if you have a question.
so if we start off with the Brownfield, this is PA 90, which amended the Brownfield Act. There's a number of different areas in this document that are highlighted, starting with definitions. While I suspect that you all understand and know what brownfield plan, brownfield or combined brownfield plan means, there are new portions that talk about department-specific activities. Let me step back. Is everybody familiar with and understand what response activities means when we use this in the brownfield? Okay, so when we talk about response activities, and let me, as a disclaimer, I am not an environmental planner. I know enough to probably be dangerous, to at least know enough to help guide this discussion. But if we need more of a deep dive, we can always bring in our environmental consultant. But response activities generally means those activities that are recognized as part of a brownfield plan or work plan that will mitigate contamination on site. So they protect the health, safety, welfare, that general terminology, but that's what we mean when we talk about response activities. Those are the environmental improvements or environmental corrections that will be made that Eagle has authority over. Non-environmental, quote unquote, response activities are just that. Those are those things that can happen during the redevelopment of a site that have no environmental component. It's not necessarily contamination of any thing in any way, shape, or form. But if you're a core community, you could get MSF funding to help with that development. We're not core, we've never been able to get that kind of non-environmental for housing-specific projects now, especially when we talk about those that are less than market rate, that would be less 80% AMI or less. We are looked at just like a core community with housing only. Let's see. If we go into the definitions, like in eligible activities, some of these are the same as they were before. Anything dealing with housing is the new part, but it's broken out into, how can I explain this? You've got eligible activities, section 1, the little I, eligible activities, section 2, which is the little I, and then eligible activities 3, 4, and 5. We fall into, as it pertains to the city of Dexter, we fall into the one for eligible activities, little I's, the 2 of them. So it's anything that's in 1 and these additional in 2, when it's housing property. If it was just a commercial development, regular brownfield applies. It's not a housing activity. Mr. Penn's project, that is one that qualifies under here. The Pelham is a market rate project, doesn't fall into this through MISHDA. It's to be determined where it falls into regarding all the amendments, because although there's a disclaimer later on in this document that says market rate housing doesn't have to go through MISHDA, it's unclear where market rate housing goes, because it can't just be through MEDC for MSF funding, because the Michigan Strategic Funding Act specifically prohibits MEDC from having any authority in a housing project. So there's a little gap there. That's not something we have to necessarily be worried about right now, but it's going to take the legislature, MEDC, and Michigan to figure that one out. Excuse me. We are now looked at just like a core community when it comes to housing, when it's affordable or attainable, as part of a housing TIF. Let's see. There's a definition for housing property, and it has to follow the different eligible activities. Housing development activities are on page 6, and it identifies what those are that can be covered under a TIF. So I'm not going to read these verbatim to you because I know you can and have, but there's a number of different housing development activities that can be covered as part of a housing TIF. I'm trying to think of some of the best ways. Most of what we'll see, like what we see with Mr. Penn's project, it falls under number 4, reimbursement provided to the developer to fill a financing gap associated with the development of housing. Price for income qualified. It's another way of saying anything less than market rate housing. Excuse me. One of the other prominent changes is infrastructure improvements. These are public improvements that are needed to support the housing development. So it wouldn't just be public improvements just because you wanted a nicer looking streetscape or something like that. This is gonna be, let's say, just for kicks and giggles, the Pelham was an affordable project. The infrastructure has to be run. That could be considered a public improvement to service the site if it was affordable or attainable. It's not, but that's the example I can give you that's at least closest, and is something you're dealing with right now. Underground parking, multi-level parking structures, and urban stormwater systems. This does allow for not only the public improvements that I just spoke about, but it also allows for some private improvements. So if we look at 3045 Broad Street, even though that project is most likely going to be a smaller type, the biggest issue with that one was the cost for the underground improvements, that underground parking. These amendments would have helped with that. The big caveat with any TIF though is whatever development is happening in whatever location that is, and whatever community, will it generate enough taxable revenue to pay off that cost over a certain year period of time? The maximum is a 30-year. Here in Dexter, the DDA is not comfortable with a 30-year TIF. There's a lot of communities that don't like to do that. And there's a lot of communities that do, they don't mind. On small communities, it really does make a lot of sense to structure your TIF projects so that they're not over 20 years. Excuse me. So while this is a great tool, it wouldn't have really helped with the project that Commensale had come in with. Could it help with a smaller project that could qualify there? Absolutely, but we'll have to go through that process and see. Qualified rehabilitation, tax increment revenues, those are all just regular definitions I thought you might want to just have a little refresher on. The key portion of the amendment that really goes to the heart of what we want to be able to utilize the tool for is found on page 15 of your packet. It's section 13B4, and this is the part that talks about all of the different things that can be covered in a housing project in a community like Dexter that isn't core. But this is also the section that mucks up the water for those market rate projects. Overall, the key takeaway, besides all the little details that we'll probably go through over and over and over again, is this is a tool. It's a tool you can decide to use, when you decide to use it, how you decide to use it, in what cases. And that's really more of where I think our discussion probably will travel. That is, what are the types of projects you might want to utilize this tool for, in what sections of the city maybe even. How can I put it? Staff needs to know is there interest in using the tool outside of the normal way we've used a brownfield? Is there interest for looking at ways to utilize this to facilitate housing development or redevelopment in the city?
So, Michelle, do me a favor.
Mhm.
You mentioned 3045 Broad, you mentioned Mike Penn, you mentioned Mike Penn's property on Grand,
Mhm.
and then the Pelham project.
Right.
3 different parcels. So starting with 3045 Broad,
Mhm.
just go through this and show me what qualifies them.
What,
As you read through the development, as you read through the definitions, they qualify because what?
two basic things.
Okay,
It's a housing development project, or it has a component that's housing.
okay,
And that housing component has a number of units that were proposed to be attainable, 80% AMI.
all right, and what page references the 80% AMI?
When they talk about qualified projects, just a second. When you talk about, page 6, under X, housing development activities, and, I'm sorry, yes, housing development activities, it brings up qualified households. The next one, housing property, also talks about, I'm sorry, it's the income qualified household. That's where it specifically brings in, households that are less than 120% AMI. And then you've got household income, I'm sorry, area median income, and that's what defines a qualified.
Okay.
Income qualified household.
So Mike Penn's property has that same qualification then, right? As proposed, or
As his is proposed, yes.
proposed, okay. Okay, so that's the section of this that we could point to.
Correct.
And this could be used within the DDA or outside the DDA, right?
Correct. The one place I'm not sure that it can be utilized yet, and that's something that both MISTA and MEDC are still working on, is a greenfield site. That's still being debated. So we have a property that's proposed for annexation. If attainable housing is actually proposed, I can't tell you if that would actually qualify, because it's more of a greenfield than within an urban center. I know this has been a lot of disjointed information. I wish that there was a way that I could envision presenting it to you in a very animated, fun way. But this has been a lot to digest. Do you have any questions for me?
Question.
I just have a numbers one. So you just referenced the Z, where it talks about 120% of the area median income.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to look at the handout you provided that gives the income limit, and it goes up to 80%, doesn't do 120% as far as I can see.
So, 120% is the 124 and above. period, that's market rate.
So the 124 would be 100% of the AMI.
Correct.
I'm just curious what 120 would be. So
Um,
I mean, I've come up with an estimate, because I don't know how they're doing, and maybe I could look into how they're figuring out their persons per family, it's maybe 148. I'm just trying to figure out what the upper bound is for what 120% of our AMI is by.
I would have to go through their methodology for how they do it. Math is not my
Yeah.
best subject, and I cannot do certain things in my head. I loved long division when I was a kid. It was fun, but when it became time to skip steps, yeah.
Well, I mean, and then I also pulled up our census estimates from 2020, which actually some have been updated with the 2021 American Community Survey. But it showed that our median household income was 86,313. They don't have that by family size necessarily. Anyways, something I might be interested in doing in the background, and then it says we have 1,894 housing units. It could be interesting to run the numbers, figure out what our cap is, how many people who live here would currently be eligible for something like 120% of the AMI, how many housing units, for example, you would reasonably expect to distribute across an income range or eligibility. That's the kind of information I guess I would be interested in figuring out. I'm not necessarily looking for you to provide it, but given your numbers.
So let me pivot on our direction real quick and talk about the goals that you all have for housing. Do you see any of them, either the ones from the master plan or in your housing task force, that have changed, need to be updated? Knowing that is a new tool to be able to facilitate more development in the city or redevelopment in the city? Let me ask it a different way. We talk a lot about how we know that there's a supply and demand imbalance. So while there is housing stock in the city, excuse me, whether that's condos, single-family detached homes, there is a demand to live here, but properties don't come on the market very often. And when they do, because there's such an imbalance, the pressure, well, basic economics kicks in. The person with the biggest amount of dollars has a greater chance of getting that property and that property cost going up. So from a shortage standpoint, is there general agreement that there's a greater demand for housing than there is supply? And if so, does that also mean you see that there's a shortage of housing in the city that people generally can afford? And when I use that word, I don't mean affordable income, I just mean what they're comfortable spending on a home.
Michelle, I'll put something out there. My goals for housing, sort of coincide with my goal to have, storefronts full and businesses that can survive and stay. And I think that in general, we need to make sure that we're providing, I think in order to want to attract different diversity in businesses or diversity in restaurants, people always say we need more restaurants, or we could use another restaurant, or we could have another whoever. If we want those to be sustainable, I think we need to have, I'm gonna say, some increase in our population. I think the more people that we have locally, the better chance we have of allowing those businesses to survive. I don't know what the magic number is.
Mhm.
I don't know what the formula is, people versus restaurants, or people versus service businesses, or whatever it is. But, I mean, for a long time, we were, in the 2000s, now we're twice that in terms of population.
Mhm.
For a long time, we didn't have hardly anybody in the DDA that would even put a resident on the downtown development authority.
Right.
Now we have many more of those options, and I think that, in the last 20 years or more, we've certainly expanded our footprint as a village or a city with the addition of single-family homes. Huron Farms, Orchard River Hills, Dexter Crossing, West Ridge are all examples of that. And they've been good examples. I think they've been well done, I think they've contributed. There's a lot of people can live close by and support that downtown. I do think that the opportunity for housing primarily exists within our core. I think that the DDA strategic plan, I identified that nearly 20 years ago, and I identified the areas between Norwalk Forest and Grand, and some of those properties where there's big parcels, one home, 3 people, 2.7 people, whatever it is, the average, as potentially able to handle more density. Now, I don't know what the perfect density is, or the acceptable density, or the acceptable building height, or all that stuff that goes with it. Some of that is sort of a flavor of the month and a feel for the people that are around when something happens. But I do think that we're headed on the right path to look at those properties as prime examples of areas where we could add people that would then support the businesses and such that need a local attention.
Mhm. Is there general consensus from the rest of the council on that, on those? Is it, anybody have anything to add to those?
I think something that would be interesting to understand is this idea of when is a community built out? I see one definition here that says less than 5% of land designated for housing remains undeveloped. I'd be curious to understand where we are. What percentage of our land designated for housing remains undeveloped? And maybe that's hard to define if you have these sort of like properties that are eligible for redevelopment and you can get a bunch more units on it, for example. I think it's also interesting to consider that, like I mentioned in a different work session, we have a fixed geographic area, barring annexation. So what is the capacity? What is the functional capacity? What is the desired capacity for housing / just development in general in that fixed area? I think, what is the boundary we are moving towards? Something else I maybe mentioned in a previous work session, I don't know it's something that the city of Dexter can do anything about necessarily, but in my, I guess, anecdotal experience, just how property taxes work in the state of Michigan, I think impedes mobility. And maybe the intention was good, as I've been told, I wasn't here at the time, I don't think that vote happened, to allow older people to stay in their homes by, capping how much property taxes can increase. But then you have 60-year-old, 70-year-old couples living in 4-bedroom homes in these family neighborhoods who maybe could, with cash, go downsize, but they're not going to because their monthly expenses are going to skyrocket because the property taxes, wherever they move, are gonna go through the roof because they've been living in that home for 30, 40 years. So I think there's definitely an impact of that, and I think it's something to consider too, if we think about, oh, well, we'll just build a bunch of starter homes. I can tell you right now, I'm in a 1,250 square foot home, which maybe some would consider a starter home. If we had, I know their families, bigger family size than mine, that live in a similar footprint. But that, and we've only been in that for 7 years, but that property tax differential is already an impedance on our desire to move up. So I think this idea of a starter home together with the property tax situation, you can get people in a situation where they don't have a big enough home, and maybe they can't afford to move somewhere else. And probably definitely not in their own community. So do you want to get people to Dexter and then they're stuck here? I don't know, maybe that's not coming out right, but there are definitely these constraints that are external to what's happening here that I think have real effects in our community, I guess.
So as a broader policy consideration, it's not just sufficient to look at the imbalance of supply and demand and that impact on the cost of properties. And just this automatically thinking the solution is more attainable or affordable housing. Before that ultimate set of potential solutions is identified, you're suggesting that we have to also take into consideration what the whole property tax challenge associated with housing.
Right,
Okay.
because that, I think that keeps maybe starter homes or family homes from coming back on the market because you have empty nesters who have no financial incentive to leave.
Right, it could, if something came up that was less expensive to purchase than what they can sell their home for, that's great. But the property taxes they're paying currently are gonna go, it's either gonna be the same in a smaller, less expensive place, or it's going to be more, depending on when they bought that house that they're trying to sell.
Right,
I hear what you're saying, I get that. My husband tells me that all the time when I say I'm downsize.
right.
I know that's something that, like, for example, the PMML has been working to educate the legislature on for the last however many years.
29 years.
Yeah. But I mean, that, there just hasn't been any forward momentum at the state level to do anything about it.
There is an article on the effects of having a proposal. In the MML, maybe that's what you're referring to. There's a good article that describes, well, it's a reasonably good article to describe. It's an example, but they use a lot of good words.
I mean, you look at other communities, markets, I guess, it's unusual as I understand it. I mean, it seems like one other approach is everybody's assessed it in like 2012. And everybody just stays. There's like a countywide reassessment, for example. And then you stay at that until there needs to be a shift. And then when there's a reassessment, everybody's reassessed, like in 2020. But this whole idea that you can have two identical houses and one person just moved in and they're paying double the property taxes. I mean, frankly, that's a disincentive for people to move here.
Anyway, but I understand what you're saying.
It's a broken system, no question.
Yeah.
I don't have a magic wand, as much as I would love to have it. I think you bring up a good point. Obviously, the TIF tool isn't going to be that catalyst for changing that. But I would also hope that, that we don't get, sidetracked by not being able to solve the taxing issue. And have that be the thing that prevents us from coming up with a good policy to start figuring out how we might be able to encourage, incentivize, bring more housing into the community. Because to Sean's point, and I definitely on this one would really like to know, I'm presuming there's probably consensus, but I'd really like to know if there isn't, housing to support the businesses throughout the community, definitely in our downtown. We can go through reams and reams of articles and reference materials and reports. You know, having a concentrated mass of people that live in your community that's your first step for supporting your business. It's not the only step, because when you look at trade areas, one of the things you see is they overlap on each other. It's you know, allowed cannibalism, if you will, but it's you still need people within your district, within your community. They may not all support every single business you've got, but that's your first line of defense. Especially in, hang on just one second. I know we can go back historically and you can talk about from the 50s before, maybe the 60s before, how the downtown was lively, people always came in. Well, that's true. You didn't have as many people as you have living in the city now. But what's the one thing that also didn't exist? You didn't have malls, you didn't have strip centers. There weren't other places to be able to get the commodities that you could get in downtown. That's changed. That whole side of the economic equation has shifted in the last 50, 70 years now. The competition isn't just more geographically out there. You can also just get on your computer. You don't even have to leave your home. So it puts even more pressure, if you will. If you want to support your businesses, having more housing in the area definitely helps. That doesn't necessarily mean single-family homes. Is it fair to say that this council does agree with that premise?
Well, there's data to show that people who live within walking distance of downtowns generally spend $10,000 to $20,000 a year in downtown businesses, so I don't know how we argue with data. Well, I guess I agree with data.
Well, and the thing that I think has been a common theme across, I'm gonna dare say, most councils with this one in proceedings, is that all of the councils have supported growing the population. Whether it's one person or generally with the incrementally, I don't believe anybody's, there's been any council that's indicated that we're full. And there's a lot of topics that get thrown around as reasons why we shouldn't grow. Traffic, too many cars. But I think all that has sort of reset itself a couple of times. Reset itself, it reset itself back in 2008 when we had the downturn in the economy. People moved either out of Michigan or away. And it reset itself here locally during the pandemic when so many businesses and industries in learned that people could work from home and accomplish largely the same thing.
Mhm.
So a lot of the reasons that are historically used to, as negative impacts of housing locally, like I say, cars, I don't think are as really as valid anymore.
That's a really good point, and it leads to,
But that's just one man's opinion.
it leads to a question. While there's general consensus for why housing is needed, what are the concerns that council has, or would have, with providing, or supporting more housing options in town? And when I say town, I mean the whole city, not just downtown. Are there any concerns?
Go ahead, please.
I mean, I think the public forum component, public engagement, whatever that ends up looking like on this topic, is really important. I think our first and primary obligation is to people who currently live here. What is it they're looking for from this community? What is it they're looking for when it comes to how much preserved green space, for example? Whether it be in parks or something else. I mean, I don't think we would ever use the same mechanism, but the surrounding townships do their land preservation, for example. Because that's what either the representatives or hopefully the people want in that community. They want some land that stays not developed for whatever period of time that agreement allows. So I think it's important to engage the public on the topic. Recognizing that maybe the default is that people move to a place and never want anything to change. I don't know if that's universally true.
It's common though.
Right, and probably human nature.
Yeah,
I mean,
agree.
you pick up a place for a reason, right?
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
and nothing ever stays the same, that is, whether we talk about people or plants, animals, communities,
Right.
nothing stays the same.
And I think too, I mean, it says, for example, in our zoning ordinance related to PUDs, the PUD shall not change the essential character of the surrounding area, or something like that. So, I mean, there's character in Dexter to be protected. And what comprises that maybe differs for different people, but I would also be curious to know what the public, what is it about Dexter that is its essential character? And would future housing developments encroach on that, or would it not?
If I may, I'd like to add to that, I agree with that, public engagement. I think there is also how are we able to share information and educate in things that may not be in our control, in things that is impacting overall because of the county or the state. There are a lot of aspects to that I think engagement and education and information sharing all should go hand in hand to be able to have a constructive conversation about it. I do agree with the sense that what do people want in town, right? And what are the things that they cherish? What are the things that it can be added while we are thinking about the growth of the town? To me, a sustainable growth is healthy. A growth based on not really how fast we wanna grow, but how, what's the word I'm looking for? How meaningful it is and how, again, sustainable it is. Because we do need to grow in a way to keep the, a lot of the good things that this city has without a sustainable growth, it can't remain. So it's really being able to have that information shared to then say, okay, so now collectively, what do we think and how do we think this growth should look like? This entire area is growing. We know it is growing. it's whether we figure out how best to be part of that in the way that Dexter wants. Or there might be a lot of issues and, the growth will pass us and we are left behind. So, I'm not opposed to growth. I think it is, a sustainable growth is healthy. I think it is needed. And housing is as part of it. It brings more people, everybody said, it supports the businesses, it supports the area, it supports the schools, there's a lot that comes from that, is just being mindful about how we are planning and thinking of it. And being able to educate and share information.
Is there any information that I haven't thought about that I need to bring back to you as we continue to work through developing a framework for housing policy and ultimately the tools that you may or may not be using?
Well, that's what, do we need a policy? Or that statement you just said, do we need a housing policy?
I usually the policy is the guide that staff looks at for when questions come in and proposals get made. Having an understanding of where we are helps to be able to provide assistance to residents, to businesses, potentially developers, and knowing how those tools, how you want to use whatever tools is also necessary. Otherwise, if we don't have at least some foundation on which to work often, it could end up taking longer for projects to move through a timeline. That's how I envision it.
I would just be curious to know, like, how many parcels we have and how many are vacant? Is that a calculable thing?
How many what?
Like percentage of vacant parcels? Is that a thing? That is calculable?
I think we did that at the beginning of the master plan, if I remember right, but I can go back to some of that may have changed. We've got X number of vacant parcels throughout the city. We also ran a calculation based on if you allowed for narrower lots, what that did to increase potentially the number of developable properties within the city. We could rerun that.
And do we have somewhere like distribution of like housing parcel types? I don't know if I've asked this before, but of parcels, how many are for housing? How many of those are single family home? How many of those are, do we know?
So
Or owner occupied versus rental,
where we've got basic data that we get through census and SunCog on occupied or not occupied, rental versus owner occupied. Those are broad numbers. As we go down the path of figuring out the rental inspection certification, those numbers will get refined if and when that program gets instituted, because then you've got a registration and you'll base your numbers, or the numbers will be based on that registration. Whereas right now, you don't have a registration. We know when new properties are, what they're gonna be. But we have no mechanism for tracking properties, specifically structures that were converted from a single family historically to a multiple family when the zoning was different throughout the city. And that would be in the sixties and seventies when that happened.
So that's a good point, that's what I was thinking of, that we sort of do have a policy on the housing and the development that we're looking for, just based on the zone.
Right, we've got-
And so, I mean, if we vary from that zone map, then I think it is time that you gotta ask other people, what do you think? So I think that's kind of a policy, that's kind of how I look at it.
I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
There is policy, I always say it, in the master plan. The zoning ordinance is the law, the rules, the requirements that implements that policy. When I ask about it for you, it's more in line of knowing what the housing policy as it pertains to using tools. So, it could be something as broad as, do you want to take the use of this specific tool in the brownfield and housing TIF tool on a case-by-case basis? Or do you want to do something that's more blanket where you say, we will consider this for all attainable projects that come in. We will not consider it for anything X percentage and above. So, in other words, it's the opposite of the shotgun rifle approach. Usually, everything in, things in land use and engineering are very targeted, very precise. The rifle, right, and rifle's targeted. And the shotgun is kind of broad and scattered. With this housing tool, it depends on how much flexibility you want to build into the use of it. You want it to be broad and utilized and considered on case by case, or do you want to be specific and only use it for specific types of housing that you want to see come in? Pros and cons of both ways, and I don't expect an answer tonight on that one. That's something to really think about.
Well, one of the things that we talked a lot about in the housing task force was that, well, you know, there was hundreds and hundreds of houses that got built from the late 90s through the 2000s. But, I mean, 99% of it was single family homes, right?
It's all single family, right?
And really during the Great Recession, 2010, 2012, that was the last time that we had housing stock that fell into that, you know, into a range that most people would look and say, I can afford that. There was some point along the line between 2012 and 2016, 17, where things were just, I mean, they basically just went straight up for the last 10 years. I mean, really hasn't stopped very much there, it might have plateaued at a point. But, I mean, I think I'm in favor of using the tools. It's been very difficult to build housing. Every single developer that comes in says it's difficult, right? Because the cost involved, the building that's involved, we're never gonna get to the diversity of housing if we don't have some tools that are gonna help people to build. I mean, if it's something we can do to help, and it contributes to that diversity, until we get to the point where we say, we don't need that kind of housing. And I've had more people, or heard more people say, my kids can't live here, if I was to buy here again now, I can't afford it. You know, those type of things, then I've heard people say, I don't wanna have, you know, housing that people can move into, I like it the way it is, and those type of things. I mean, I don't think we need more single-family housing like we have. I think we're limited right now because we're at a weird point because of the interest rates and that people aren't selling them. You know, even if you go back 5 or 6 years, houses were turning over. You know, people were buying and selling them. Now they're so expensive, people can't sell them. It's not only the taxes that go up, it's the payment that goes up because you get an interest rate. So the only people that can really sell and move down is if you have a cash sale, right? You're gonna go buy something without a mortgage. So, I mean, I would say I'd be more in favor of using the tools where we can help to build something that we think would be helpful. And I think that's more of a question for the community and overall discussion on, you know, how much of that do we really want to support? I think the Mike Pence project is a great example. If they have a waiting list at Walkabout Creek, and that's markedly apartments or in the attainable area, then if they have a big waiting list, then obviously we need more housing like that. But I'm sure people would say there's a waiting list for people to buy single family homes as well. The difference is, unless we annex large pieces of land, we can't build lots of single family homes. You know, that's what happened in the late nineties to the 2000s. You know, I mean, all three subdivisions essentially went in, and same neighborhoods went in at the same time. And yeah, we got a ton of houses that weren't necessarily here before. But, you know, really, after Walkabout Creek, I'm not sure that we've had of housing that's similar to that. I mean, it just sort of never happened during that whole time.
Right.
So I think there's a need. I don't know how much of a need there is. I think the projects that we have, I'm in favor of using those in those projects if it helps them, because I know they're all running into the difficulties economically of trying to make those projects go, as even on 3045 package. So.
Would it be helpful to council as we work through this? Do you want to set up another committee, not necessarily a task force, but a subcommittee of council to sort of do the legwork with staff, and then come back, with information that addresses, some of the different points that you brought up this evening? Or do you just want staff to do that and come back to you at a future date?
I'm happy to have you come back with information.
I'm sorry?
I'm happy to have you come back with information, unless council wants to have another committee.
Okay, I think we're done. Yeah.
Thanks for putting all this together, Michelle.
You're welcome. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate. I know this is a rather dry subject. I'll find ways to make it more exciting.
Okay, let's take 2 minutes, let people use restrooms, and then we'll come back and start at 7:05. Oh, yeah, sorry, I got to conclude, yep, sorry. Is there any non-arranged participation? Seeing none, we'll adjourn the workshop. That's just-
Oh, it's fine.
Oh, that's fine, yeah, good to see you again.